Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I want to thank each of you for joining us today, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our new guest, David Espindola. David, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Absolutely. Now, let me introduce David to you for those that haven't met him yet. He's the founding partner of Intercepting Horizons, an advisor and the author of a brand new book. The book is called The Exponential Era: Strategies to Stay Ahead of the Curve in the Era of Chaotic Change and Disruptive Forces. He's written that with his co-author, Michael Wright. So, David, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. We're excited about the release of the book. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book with you and your audience.
Absolutely. So how many years of experience has been compressed into those pages?
Oh, wow. Quite a few.
Let me ask you about some of the areas that you cover in the book. One of them is you write a lot about the notion of speed. So just to,
Right.
every few pages you're talking about speed, the speed of change and the speed of this and the speed of that. Talk to us about why that's so important today.
Yeah, so speed is a key characteristic of this new era that we have coined the exponential era. So the changes that we're experiencing right now and the speed with which things are changing are unprecedented. Things are moving faster now than they did just a decade ago. And this is due to a number of factors. So first of all, we have technology that's growing exponentially. So the exponential growth of technology has in its roots Moore's law, which basically says that computing capacity doubles every 18 months. And since most technologies are now supported by digital capabilities, all industries are now subject to Moore's law. So that's one. Second, we now have several exponential platforms. And in the book, we listed 8 of them. So we have artificial intelligence, blockchain, biotechnology, quantum computing, Internet of Things, 3D printing, robotics, and material science. So there are other thought leaders out there that categorize these platforms a little bit different, and you could have up to 12 or more of these platforms, depending on how you categorize them. So we decided to categorize them into these 8. But the key point here is that we've never had a period of time when so many of these platforms flourished in just a decade or two. To find another time period when this happened, you'd have to go back to the early 1900s. And back then, there were only 3 of those platforms, which were, the internal combustion engine, electricity, and telephony. So this is really a very different time period that we've never seen anything like it before. And then third, these technologies are converging. And because they are converging, then they can create combinatorial multipliers that amplify even more their impact. And the reason why this is so important, it goes back to something that we like to say, and that is the strategies that you used in the past will not help you intercept future horizons.
Very interesting. So, David, you also use in one of your early chapters in the book, staying ahead of the curve. Now, I've recently wrote a whole article on that concept of ahead of the curve, both from a scientific perspective and from fighter pilots in dogfighting in the U.S. Air Force and of course, in other air forces. So they both use different notions of that. So let's just get your definition. When you say, one of the big goals is staying ahead of the curve, what's that mean to you?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I think the best way to explain it is to illustrate with an example. So if you take a regular 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, okay, and then you fold it in half, and then you keep doing that, you're going to be able to do it about 6 or 7 times. And after you've done it about 6 or 7 times, you're going to end up with a piece of paper that's about this thick, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this. If you could fold that same piece of paper 50 times, how thick do you think that piece of paper would get? Any idea?
No idea.
Okay, so I'll give you the answer. So basically what you're doing here, every time you're folding that paper, you're doubling the thickness of that paper, right?
Okay, yes.
So when you did it about 6 or 7 times, it doubled, a few times, it got about this thick.
Yeah.
If you were able to do it 50 times, the thickness of that paper would be the equivalent of the distance from here to the sun. I'm just going to pause for a moment to let that sink in, right?
Oh, yes, I understand now.
So, and the point of this example is just to illustrate the nature of exponential growth, right? Because it's very deceiving. In the beginning, it doesn't look like much is happening. It's happening very slowly, right? The curve, the exponential curve, looks basically flat. And then suddenly you hit an inflection point. And once it hits that inflection point, the curve goes straight up, right?
So that's the whole notion of the hockey stick, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and the point is, if you wait until changes are obvious to everyone else, you are already behind, right? And you won't be able to catch up. So that's exactly what we mean by staying ahead of the curve.
And so the goal there is, of course, in a competitive environment, you need to be ahead of the rest of them.
Absolutely.
So that's the notion. They have to be sense making. They have to be seeing the changes, all of that before they happen, so they can be prepared and ready to act. Right?
You got it. Absolutely.
Very, very good. Another concept you write about, you say here, this is a quote from your book: technology investments alone are not sufficient to achieve a successful adaptation to speed and the scale of change. And it takes a cultural change. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. So in our SPX methodology, we have two foundational components. One is culture and behaviors, and the other is executive engagement. So the best way to illustrate this concept of why culture and behavior is so important is by giving you an example. And a classic example, the best one that I could find, is Microsoft. So Microsoft missed the most significant technology trends in the early 21st century. So they missed mobile, they missed social, and they missed cloud. In fact, Paul Graham, you may have heard of. He's an influential, Silicon Valley investor, and he's the founder of Y Combinator. He even wrote an article that was titled "Microsoft is Dead." And so the board, realized that they needed to make changes, and so they promoted Satya Nadella to become CEO of Microsoft. And so when Nadella came in, what he found was a culture that really prized being smart above everything else. And so what that means is that there wasn't a lot of teamwork going on. And then in his book titled Hit Refresh, Nadella talks about the fact that, what he had to do was change Microsoft's mindset from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Because, intelligence is not really binary. It's something that you can cultivate and you can grow. And if you have great collaboration and teamwork, you can actually, produce a lot more than if you're trying to do things individually and trying to prove that you're smarter than everybody else. So Nadella put a lot of emphasis on teamwork, a lot of emphasis on empathy, which, to some people may seem a little bit strange. You'd think that a tech CEO coming in, that his priority would be, trying to get his hands on some emerging technology and making some changes from a technology standpoint. But what he really focused on was changing the culture first and foremost. And he attributes that to his ability to turn the company around. And today, Microsoft has regained its status as one of the most influential tech companies in the world.
No,
So I think that illustrates why that is so, so important.
absolutely. That's a terrific example. And I think, yeah, just look at their success in cloud today and their success in all that. That's just brilliant there, too. So, in another chapter in your book, this one was called The Threat of Being Amazoned and Uberized. You talk about a company that was a category king and was very confident, but when you guys went in, you looked at it and you were concerned that they may be disrupted. What did you see there that actually created that concern?
Yeah, so this is a very traditional company in a very traditional industry, and they had 100 years of success behind them. They have thousands of employees that are doing things in very traditional ways, and in many cases, they're not, the most efficient ways of doing things. And so, but they were very successful, and success sometimes can be a double-edged sword, right? Because you can become very comfortable and very confident and very complacent at the same time. So this was your classic Clayton Christensen's innovator's dilemma, right?
Yes.
Do you cannibalize the current profitable business so that you can focus on, unproven future opportunities? Just to give you another example, I'm currently reading Bob Iger's book, The Ride of a Lifetime. I don't know if you've read it. I highly recommend it. Fantastic book. And in the book, chapter 12 is called If You Don't Innovate, You Die. And so there's a section of the book, and I'd like to, if I may, just read a section of the book because it really captures this thought really well. So this is Bob Iger, right? And he was the CEO of Disney. And he said, the question for us was, did we have the stomach to start cannibalizing our own still profitable businesses in order to begin building a new model? Could we disrupt ourselves? And would Wall Street tolerate the losses that we would inevitably incur to truly modernize and transform the company completely? And then he concludes by saying, in essence, we were now hastening the disruption of our own business, and the short-term losses were going to be significant. So, he was making this case to the board that there needed to be some significant changes to Disney if they were to survive in this new era, which, we call the exponential era. And so there was one thing that he said to the board that I think really captures the thought behind this whole idea. And what he said was, I know why companies fail to innovate. It's tradition. Tradition generates so much friction every step of the way. And so, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that companies face today. It takes real courage for you to break with tradition. And that's why we were so concerned about that example that we gave in the book.
Oh yeah, I've had the opportunity throughout my career to spend a lot of time meeting with leadership teams. And oftentimes you'll have some very ambitious leadership teams, but their organization, their people, their long-term employees, boy, they did not want to shift. Yeah. They were in a comfortable seat doing a comfortable job, and they wanted nothing to do with change, although it was desperately needed and recognized in leadership. So yeah, I've seen that many a time, David.
Yeah, change is hard, right? I mean, we all like the status quo. We become comfortable, right? And so making a significant change, especially if you have to cannibalize something that's working today, that's a tough decision.
Oh yeah, and we actually see that in politics too, where there's a desire to go back to another more comfortable age, whether that be the 50s or the 60s or sometime in the past. Oftentimes it's a mythical time in the past, but it's the time that in our mind we perceived was more comfortable, more manageable, more friendly or something. And we're always wanting to go backwards, but it just doesn't work that way, does it?
That's right. Yeah. No, it doesn't. You got to move forward. Absolutely.
Now, another reoccurring theme in your book is about the complexity and chaos that we all find ourselves having to manage a business in the middle of this complexity and chaos. What advice do you have for companies on how they should approach that?
I would tell them embrace them. We like to say that the difference between an opportunity and a threat is the time horizon in which you see it. Many companies are afraid of embracing this chaos and the complexity, but if you manage them well, then you have a competitive advantage. In our methodology, if you use SPX or if you use something similar, it doesn't have to be SPX. We believe you're going to be light years ahead of your competitors. Um, Again, you don't have to use what we prescribe, but you should understand the principles behind it and should use those principles to your advantage.
Mm. Now, on the topic of chaos and complexity, so not only do we have all this transformation happening, all this change being required, the complexity of a digital era, new kinds of business models and subscription models instead of license models, all this chaos and complexity. But now we have our marketplaces where our consumers seem to have different or different realities. Half of them believe something's true, others believe it's false. Facts mean one thing to one group and facts mean another to another group. What advice do you have for business leaders trying to work within a marketplace where there's alternative realities?
Well, Kevin, your questions are becoming increasingly more difficult, but I'll give it a shot.
I'll just keep asking until you stop answering them.
Okay, sounds good. I think we start with what we talked about in the very beginning, right? First of all, we need to recognize that things are changing extremely fast. So it's only natural that consumers get confused about, what's fact, what's truth. And, we're all trying to adapt to this new era and to the way things are changing so fast. But, our brains were designed to deal with linear progression. So this whole exponential thing is really difficult for us to deal with. So that's one view. Um, Second, I think companies need to really be in touch with the edges of the organization. Andy Grove said that snow first melts on the edges. And so it's really important for leaders to be in touch with their customers, with their frontline workers, so they can detect the early signals of change and really hear firsthand, what the frontline employees are hearing and seeing, and then be prepared, for those changes that are coming. And then the third thing I would say is that I think we all need to realize something that Steve Jobs taught us. Steve used to quote Henry Ford in saying, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? So it's a combination of you got to listen, you got to be out there, you need to be on the edges of the organization, you got to detect the early signals, but then you got to blend in your magic and help educate people because they don't even know what it is that they want, right? So it's a combination of those things that will help you be successful in this new era.
No, so you did awesome, David. Great. No, that makes perfect sense to me. Thank you for sharing your wisdom there. One
Sure.
last question here before we wrap it up.
Yeah.
Just in the last week, I've seen examples of social media organized boycotts and then boycotts where everybody should go buy something. And then we've seen, the swarming mentality around GameStop. We've seen kind of flash mob behaviors that led to insurrections at the Capitol building. We've seen all these social media organized events that actually impact businesses. You know, the whole concept, the cancel culture, right? Where an organized group to stop doing business with somebody or stop watching movies with a particular actor. So we're seeing this. I mean, what we're seeing right now is that you can have the best run business in the world, but suddenly you can get organized boycotts against your products because somebody did something somewhere. You know, how do you prepare for that when you're trying to run an ethical, good business and you're trying to do it all right, but, you know, there's just this chaos out there?
So you weren't kidding when you said you're going to keep the questions becoming harder and harder until I quit, right? So, all kidding aside, I think, you know, it goes back to, you know, first of all, what I just said previously. Be in touch with the edges of the organization. I think this is really fundamental. Second, I think we need to recognize that everything is changing, right? And society is changing just as fast in this exponential era. So it's no longer sufficient for companies to just focus on shareholder needs. They really need to think much broader and understand the needs of all stakeholders. And I think, you know, this generation, this new generation in particular, is very sensitive to that. You know, this is a generation that's very engaged in activism. And, you know, despite of the shortcomings of social media has really given an outlet for consumers to express their views. And they're not shy about doing that, right? So, I mean, this whole thing that happened with GameStop, it's just, you know, mind blowing. It's really incredible what just happened. So, you know, I think people are becoming more and more conscious about spending their money on brands that represent their values, and I think that's a good thing. I think business leaders really need to pay attention to what's going on out there. And, you know, they need to realize that people will no longer tolerate insincerity. They won't tolerate lack of authenticity. So I think the best policy is for companies to really be fully transparent and take responsibility for their actions, and you know, have the courage to say, "I'm sorry, I screwed up," when they make mistakes. So I think if they do those things, I think they're going to do fine.
David, once again, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom with all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a great pleasure.